Carl Jung explains why they hurt you and act like nothing happened. They betrayed you, then smiled like nothing happened. They broke your heart and moved on like you never existed. But what if I told you this wasn't about you at all? According to Carl Jung, their silence, their cruelty, and their denial are rooted in something far more disturbing than you think. In this video, we'll uncover the dark psychology behind why they hurt you and acted like nothing happened. And more importantly, how to rise from the wreckage with power, clarity, and peace. Part 1. The defense mechanisms of the one who hurt you. Ego in a state of denial. When someone hurts you and acts like nothing happened, it's not always about malice or calculated cruelty. Often, it's about defense. Deep, primitive, unconscious defense. According to Carl Jung, the ego, a person's conscious identity, will go to extreme lengths to preserve itself, even if it means denying wrongdoing, suppressing guilt, or rewriting the story entirely. The individual who hurts you may not simply be ignoring your pain, they may be protecting themselves from their own. Let's examine how this works through the lens of Jungian depth psychology. The ego's desperate need to preserve innocence. The ego is the center of our conscious awareness. It wants to believe it is good, rational, moral, and justified. Anything that challenges this self-image is perceived as a threat. According to Jung, when someone harms another person, especially someone close to them, it creates a fracture between their behavior and their self-image. To reconcile this dissonance, they either must acknowledge the wrongdoing and feel shame, or B, deny it ever happened. For many, especially those who are emotionally immature or wounded, option B is far easier. They may minimize what they did. It wasn't that bad. They may rationalize it. You made me do it. They may externalize blame. You're too sensitive. Or they may act like it never happened at all. In each case, the core goal is the same: preserve the illusion of moral integrity. This illusion is what keeps the ego afloat. To admit fault would be to face the shadow of confrontation many people are unwilling or unable to endure. Denial as an ego defense, a Jungian breakdown. Denial is one of the most primitive defense mechanisms. It operates by erasing the painful reality and replacing it with an alternate narrative, one that allows the ego to remain intact. Jung recognized denial not as a simple lie, but as an unconscious rejection of truth to avoid psychic collapse. When someone acts like they didn't hurt you, it's often not a strategic manipulation. It's a form of self-protection. They deny the truth not just to you but to themselves. They've rewritten the memory, edited the dialogue, and recast themselves as the misunderstood victim or innocent bystander. To the outside world, they may seem indifferent or cold. Internally, they're trapped in a fragile house of psychological mirrors. They can't admit fault because doing so would unravel the web of lies that sustains their self-worth. Avoidance of guilt and shame. Jung believed guilt and shame were among the most terrifying emotions a human can face. These emotions don't just prick the ego, they annihilate it. People who hurt others often carry immense guilt they cannot process. So instead, they exile it. They bury it in the unconscious and mask it with arrogance, denial, or even rage. Ironically, the more someone denies guilt, the more likely they are to repeat the same behavior. Why? Because nothing has been integrated. No healing has taken place. Without conscious ownership of one's destructive behavior, the cycle continues, and so does the pain. This is how you can end up being hurt by the same person over and over again, because in their mind, they never really hurt you to begin with. The compartmentalized self. Another reason people hurt you and act unaffected is what Jung described as psychological fragmentation. The self becomes compartmentalized. One part of them can be cruel, vindictive, or emotionally abusive, while another part remains charming, friendly, and rational. These parts don't talk to each other. The nice guy's self does not acknowledge the abuser self. They exist in different rooms of the psyche. So when they act like nothing happened, it's not always insincerity, it's psychological disconnection. They can look you in the eye, smile, and act normal, not because they've forgotten what happened, but because the part of them interacting with you has no access to the memory or guilt of what they've done. It's like switching emotional masks. The mask facing you doesn't recall what the previous mask did. This is particularly common in individuals with unresolved trauma, narcissistic tendencies, or deep emotional wounds. They've learned to dissociate from pain by creating multiple psychic compartments, each one designed to avoid internal conflict. Jung's concept of the persona and its role in denial. Jung described the persona as the mask we wear in social settings, the part of us that adapts to roles, expectations, and norms. The person who hurt you may be deeply attached to a persona that says, "I'm a good parent," or "I'm a loving partner," or "I'm a loyal friend." If their actions contradict that persona, they're forced to choose between truth and illusion. Most will cling to illusion. By continuing to play the role, acting as though everything is fine, they're maintaining their grip on identity. To admit the truth would mean not only acknowledging that they hurt you, but also confronting the fact that their entire self-concept is flawed. And for many, that is intolerable. The unconscious script. Repetition of pain. Many who hurt others are repeating scripts they learned in childhood. If they grew up in emotionally chaotic or abusive environments, they may have internalized the belief that harming others is normal or even necessary for self-protection. Jung referred to this as a cluster of unconscious thoughts and emotional patterns rooted in early experience. These complexes operate like emotional time bombs. When triggered, the person reacts automatically, defensively, destructively, and afterward, they don't always remember or care to. That's because the complex did the acting. The conscious ego wasn't fully present, and so the ego continues on, unbothered by consequences it doesn't fully comprehend. This is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. It reveals that behind the coldness and indifference may lie a person whose inner world is fractured, fragmented, and largely unconscious. Projection. When they blame you for their actions. Jung's concept of projection is crucial here. Many people can't tolerate seeing their own flaws, so they project them onto others. If someone hurts you and then acts like you're the problem, this is projection in action. They might say things like, "You're too sensitive. You always overreact. You twist everything I say." These accusations are psychological boomerangs. They reflect the person's own guilt, shame, or unresolved trauma, but instead of owning it, they throw it at you. By making you the bad guy, they escape accountability. They get to preserve their self-image while simultaneously punishing you for their own emotional failures. Projection is a powerful tool of avoidance, and it's often used by those who cannot face the shadow within. Suppression of empathy. Jung viewed empathy not as a fixed trait, but as a developmental achievement. People become more empathetic as they confront their own inner wounds and integrate the shadow. But for those who remain fragmented, empathy is often suppressed or selectively applied. Someone may be capable of showing great compassion to animals, strangers, or co-workers, but not to you. Why? Because you represent a mirror, a threat, a person who knows what they did. Their lack of remorse is not always lack of feeling. It's often an act of psychic avoidance. Empathy would force them to face your pain, and by extension, their guilt, so they shut it down, not because they don't care, but because caring would shatter the illusion. Acting normal as a coping mechanism. When someone acts like nothing happened after hurting you, it's not always an intentional manipulation. Sometimes it's their only coping strategy. Pretending everything is fine allows them to move on without having to process the consequences of their actions. This is especially true for people who lack emotional intelligence or have a fragile ego structure. They need the appearance of normalcy to function. Confrontation would threaten the entire psychological house of cards they built. So they smile, they text, they make jokes, not because they have healed, but because they've buried the damage. And the more they act like nothing happened, the more surreal it feels for you because your reality and theirs are no longer aligned. You're living with the pain, they're living in denial. The cost of denial. But make no mistake, this denial has a cost, Jung said. What you resist persists. The person who refuses to face their shadow becomes increasingly possessed by it. Their relationships deteriorate. Their inner peace erodes. The guilt seeps through in nightmares, anxiety, and unexplained anger. They may fool themselves for a while, but not forever. At some point, the psyche demands balance. And if they continue to hurt others without accountability, the consequences will show up in their health, their relationships, and their spiritual emptiness. Part 2: The repressed shadow. When the one who hurt you is a victim of themselves. If you've ever been hurt by someone who then denies it, avoids it, or blames you for it, you might ask, how can they live with themselves? According to Carl Jung, the answer lies in one of the most powerful and terrifying psychological truths: the existence of the shadow. The shadow is not just a metaphor, it's a living psychic force. It's everything we have rejected about ourselves, buried in the unconscious because we were too afraid, ashamed, or wounded to face it. And when someone refuses to confront their shadow, it doesn't go away. It festers, it distorts, and eventually it hurts others. Sometimes, the people who wound you the most are not monsters. They are walking injuries, and the pain they inflict is just a projection of the pain they never healed within themselves. Understanding the shadow, the hidden side of the self. Jung described the shadow as the dark side of the psyche. It contains all the aspects of ourselves we've disowned: our rage, envy, cruelty, fear, selfishness, and woundedness. From a young age, we are taught what is acceptable and what is not. We then repress the unacceptable parts into the unconscious. But repression is not deletion. The shadow remains alive, influencing our behavior from behind the scenes. And when it is especially intense, when the person is full of unresolved pain, they may become consumed by their shadow without knowing it. In that state, they are no longer acting as a whole person. They are acting as a fragmented psyche, split between a socially acceptable mask and a buried, chaotic underworld. When the shadow is unconscious, it controls behavior. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In other words, if a person refuses to face the hidden parts of themselves, those parts will run the show. The shadow, when unacknowledged, doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It emerges often in moments of stress, insecurity, or emotional vulnerability. But instead of being expressed honestly, it is projected onto others, and that's when the damage begins. Someone who has repressed their own fear may accuse you of being unstable. Someone who has disowned their own anger may lash out when they feel vulnerable. Someone who was never allowed to cry may shame you for being emotional. Someone who has never known love may punish you for loving them. This isn't conscious malice. It's the shadow lashing out, desperate to be seen, but unable to ask for help in words. Wounding as a cycle. The abuser was once the abused. A core tenet of Jungian psychology is that the unresolved trauma of the past often repeats itself in the present. People who hurt others frequently do so because they were hurt first, not as an excuse but as an explanation. Imagine a child raised in an environment where emotions were mocked, vulnerability punished, and love was conditional. That child grows up with deep emotional scars, but they're told to be strong, tough, independent. They bury their fear, their sadness, their need for affection. Fast forward 20 years now. An adult, they enter relationships, but every time someone gets close, they feel threatened. Every time someone expresses emotion, they recoil. Every time they sense vulnerability, they attack. Why? Because your vulnerability awakens the pain they buried. Your affection makes them feel unworthy. Your honesty reminds them of what they were never allowed to express. So instead of welcoming your love, they reject it. And when they hurt you, they feel justified. Not because you did anything wrong, but because their inner world is still stuck in a defensive war zone. Emotional possession when the shadow takes over. Jung describes something chilling in his writings. People don't have complexes. Complexes have them. What he meant was that when a person is triggered, when their deepest wounds are touched, they may be overtaken by an unconscious complex. It's like an emotional possession. They may say things they don't mean. They may act cruelly, coldly, destructively. They may hurt you without any apparent remorse, but after the storm passes, they might feel confused, detached, or even amnesiac about what they did. What? Because the shadow was in control, and their conscious ego had been momentarily overridden. This is common in relationships where trauma is activated, and unless the person does deep inner work, the pattern will continue, not because they want to hurt you, but because they don't know who's driving the car anymore. Self-rejection becomes other rejection. Those who repress parts of themselves are often extremely judgmental toward others. Why? Because what they hate in you is what they have buried in themselves. If someone attacks your sensitivity, it may be because they were never allowed to be sensitive. If someone mocks your dreams, it may be because they gave up on theirs. If someone shames your pain, it may be because they never got to express their own. This is projection at its core, but more than that, it is self-rejection, externalized. They hurt you because they see in you a reflection of their own wounded self, and instead of embracing that reflection, they smash the mirror. Lack of integration leads to destruction. In Jungian terms, integration is the process of facing, accepting, and healing the hidden parts of the psyche. Without integration, a person is at the mercy of their shadow. The more they run from it, the more powerful it becomes. This is why people who seem put together on the outside can sometimes act in shockingly cruel ways behind closed doors. Their nice persona is just that, a persona, a surface mask that hides the storm underneath. And when that mask slips, when stress, love, or vulnerability trigger the shadow, what comes out can be terrifying, not just for you but for them too. But because they don't know what's happening, they deny it, they pretend they're fine, and they act like you're the problem. This is why being hurt by someone close to you can feel so disorienting. You're not just dealing with one person, you are dealing with a fractured psyche, locked in war with itself. The internal battlefield: guilt, shame, and emotional numbness. People who are consumed by their shadow often live in a state of chronic guilt or emotional numbness. Guilt gnaws at them, but instead of healing it, they bury it deeper. Numbness becomes a shield, a way to survive in a world that feels too painful to face. And when you come along someone who offers honesty, vulnerability, or affection, it disrupts their defenses. Your presence stirs something in them they're not ready to deal with. So they shut down, they push you away, they hurt you. And afterward, they go cold, not because they're heartless, but because their soul has learned to freeze in order to survive. This is not to romanticize abuse, but to explain the internal chaos behind it. Many people who act like they don't care more than they can handle. They're just not equipped to process it. The shadow can't heal in isolation. Here's a painful paradox Jung understood well. The person who hurts you may desperately need healing, but they won't find it alone. Yet they're too ashamed or afraid to reach out. And so they stay trapped. Trapped in a pattern of pushing away the very people who could help them heal. Trapped in the belief that vulnerability is weakness. Trapped in the illusion that they're better off numb. And because they can't own their pain, they pass it on. You become the emotional landfill for everything they couldn't deal with. Your heart becomes the battleground for their inner war. And unless you recognize this, you'll keep trying to save them at the cost of yourself. Compassion versus complicity. Jung emphasized that understanding a person's shadow does not mean excusing their behavior. You can have compassion for someone without being complicit in their destructiveness. Recognizing that someone is a victim of their own wounds does not mean you should stay and be their punching bag. In fact, walking away may be the most healing choice for both of you, because sometimes, the only way a person will face their shadow is when they lose the person who was willing to love them through it. And sometimes, the only way you will heal is by refusing to carry what was never yours. The truth about why they hurt you and pretended not to. The truth is this: they hurt you because they're hurt. They acted like nothing happened because facing what happened would destroy the image they built of themselves. They denied your pain because it reminded them of their own. But none of that means you deserved it. You were just the surface their shadow needed to emerge, the mirror that showed them what they refused to see, and when that got too real, They chose to look away. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to care for themselves. Part 3: Why they don't apologize. The split between ego and soul. You've been hurt, deeply. But what may cut even deeper is not the wound itself, it's their refusal to acknowledge it. No apology, no recognition, just silence. Or worse, indifference. You start questioning yourself. Did it really happen the way I remember? Am I overreacting? According to Carl Jung, the inability or refusal to apologize is not merely a lack of manners. It is the symptom of a profound psychological split between the ego, the mask we wear, and the soul, the deeper truth within us. People don't apologize because they don't want to admit who they really are. Or more precisely, they're terrified to see the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime hiding. The ego's addiction to innocence. At the root of a non-apologizer lies the ego's obsessive need to feel morally clean. Jung taught that the ego is a fragile, constructed identity that filters how we see ourselves and how we want the world to see us. This ego says things like, I'm a good person. I would never intentionally hurt someone. If something went wrong, it must have been their fault. Now, if that ego admits wrongdoing, even a small one, it risked cracking. And if it cracks, all the uncomfortable truths it's been holding back will begin to flood in guilt, shame, remorse, unworthiness, emotional collapse. That's why, for many people, refusing to apologize is not arrogance, it's self-preservation. They protect their innocence like a dying animal protects its final breath. To say I'm sorry would mean facing the reality that they are capable of harm, and that truth is too destabilizing for a psyche built on denial. The fragmented psyche, a person divided. In Jungian psychology, the soul and the ego are often in conflict. The soul seeks wholeness, honesty, transformation. The ego seeks comfort, control, and the illusion of stability. When someone hurts you and can't or won't apologize, it often means their ego has overpowered their soul. The deeper part of them knows they've done wrong, but the ego shouts louder. Don't admit it. You'll look weak. You'll lose control. You'll fall apart. This internal war creates a psychic fracture. They might even convince themselves that nothing happened, or that you deserved it, or that it's not a big deal. And in that moment, they are not one person, they are two voices in one body arguing about what's real and what must be erased. Apology requires ego death. To truly apologize is to surrender, not performatively but fully. It means allowing your ego to at least momentarily. It means dropping the defense mechanisms, facing the pain you've caused, and stepping into humility. This is terrifying for someone who has never done it before. Because what follows a true apology is vulnerability. And for some people, especially those with narcissistic traits, trauma, or shame-based identities, of vulnerability feels like death. So they avoid it. They rewrite history. They stay silent. They gaslight. Not because they don't care, but because they're scared that if they admit this mistake, all their inner darkness will be exposed. Narcissistic wounding and the fear of shame. Jung understood narcissism not as vanity, but as a defense against deep, unhealed wounds. Many narcissistic personalities are built around a childhood experience of emotional neglect, rejection, or humiliation. Apologizing would expose that original wound. It would say, I did something wrong, which in their unconscious translates to, I am unlovable, I am worthless, I am nothing. That's why they avoid it at all costs. They'd rather hurt you more than feel shame. They'd rather make you question your reality than confront their own fragility. Because the act of apologizing while healing for a secure psyche is devastating to a psyche built on unworthiness. Apology demands self-confrontation. Jung emphasized that real growth comes only through confronting the self, and that's exactly what an apology demands. To say I'm sorry is to say, I see what I did. I accept that I hurt you. I take responsibility. For someone disconnected from their inner world, that is too much reality at once. They may have spent years, even decades, building psychological walls so high that nothing gets through, not even the truth. And so, when their behavior causes harm, They dissociate, they play dumb, they dismiss it, not because the facts aren't obvious, but because they can't survive the truth. Rewriting the narrative to avoid accountability. People who refuse to apologize often create alternative realities to avoid taking blame. This could look like minimizing the hurt, you're being dramatic. Blaming you if you weren't so sensitive, I wouldn't have reacted like that. Redefining intent, didn't mean it that way. Pretending it didn't happen, what are you talking about? This is known as narrative manipulation, and it serves one goal: keep the ego intact. Rather than acknowledge I acted cruelly, they convince themselves. I was just defending myself, instead of, I betrayed you, they might say. You misunderstood. Jung warned that people who live in denial become more and more disconnected from reality over time. And the longer they avoid apologizing, the harder it becomes, because now, they're not just defending an action, they're defending an entire worldview. Apology requires empathy, and empathy requires integration. Empathy is the emotional bridge between two people. But in Jungian thought, empathy requires self-awareness. You cannot feel into another's experience if you are cut off from your own. Those who can't apologize are often emotionally disintegrated. They've locked away their own pain, which means they can't access yours. Your suffering may even trigger their own buried emotions, and that's why they shut it down. To apologize means letting your guard down and stepping into someone else's emotional world. But if you've never faced your own emotional world, that's impossible. That's why many people, especially those who grew up in emotionally repressive environments, find it easier to shut down than say, I was wrong. Jung's individuation, the path to a real apology. Jung's concept of individuation becoming a whole. Integrated self requires facing your shadow and owning your wounds. It means aligning ego and soul, not letting one dominate the other. A sincere apology can only come from someone who has begun this process. They've looked at their mistakes. They've felt their shame. They've confronted the inner demons that drove them to hurt others. And now they have enough inner strength to say, I'm sorry. But someone who hasn't individuated, someone still ruled by ego and unconscious fear, will rarely apologize. Not because they don't feel sorry, but because they lack the structure to express it. They are still fragmented. And fragmented people don't take responsibility. They take cover. What happens when you wait for an apology that never comes? Perhaps the most soul-wrenching part of all this is when you are left waiting for something that never arrives. The apology, the acknowledgement, the decency, the human response. It doesn't come, and your heart begins to wither. You replay the event. You question your memory. You ask, was it my fault? Did I deserve it? Am I overreacting? This is the psychological trap, the unrepentant. They infect your mind with their denial, and if you're not careful, you begin carrying the guilt that was never yours to hold. Jung warned of this psychic contamination. When one person refuses to own their shadow, it can seep into the unconscious of the other, especially in close relationships. So if they won't apologize, you must, not to them, but to yourself, for doubting your pain, for tolerating their silence, for waiting for them to become someone they're not yet capable of being. Why some people will never say I'm sorry. Some people won't apologize because they genuinely believe they did nothing wrong. They fear losing power. They feel shame too deep to bear. They're trapped in trauma and dissociation. Their ego is more important than your relationship. They were never taught how to be accountable. Their psychological walls are thicker than your truth. None of these reasons excuse the behavior, but understanding them can free you from the invisible grip they have on your mind. Healing without their apology. The truth is, you may never get closure from them, but you don't need their apology to validate your pain. Jung emphasized that the journey of healing is inward, not dependent on others. Your task is to stop seeking restoration from the same place you were destroyed. Your power is reclaiming the narrative they tried to erase. Your freedom is in forgiving yourself, not them, for staying in denial longer than your soul could bear. Because the apology you're waiting for won't come from them. It will come from the part of you that says, I didn't deserve this, I deserve better, and I'm no longer available for emotional exile. Part 4: The duality of human nature, why even good people can be cruel. It's one of the most disorienting experiences in life. Someone you trust, love, or admire, someone who presents as kind, decent, or spiritual, turns around and deeply wounds you. It doesn't make sense. How can someone be so good in some moments and so harmful in others? Carl Jung warned us about this paradox, that human beings are not either or, they are both, and we are light and dark, good and evil, loving and cruel. And the most dangerous people are not those who are openly malicious, but those who believe they are only good because they've buried their capacity for harm so deeply, they act it out unconsciously. Jung's core premise: the shadow exists in everyone. At the center of Jung's depth psychology is the shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche that contains everything we reject about ourselves. That includes our shame, jealousy, hatred, rage, and sadism. You might think you're kind, but according to Jung, there's cruelty inside you too. You might think you're peaceful, but there's violence in you too. You might think you're forgiving, but there's vengeance hiding beneath that smile. It's not about being evil, it's about being human. We are born whole, but society conditions us to split. We keep the parts that are praised and exile the parts that are shamed. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It becomes unconscious and acts itself out when we least expect it. The danger of good person syndrome. Some of the most damaging individuals are those who need to believe they're always the good guy. Jung called this identification with the persona the socially approved mask we wear. This person may volunteer at church, give to charity, be adored in public, be articulate, charming, and respectable. But behind closed doors, they lie, manipulate, guilt trip, or emotionally abuse others. The reason they're so dangerous is because they refuse to believe they are capable of harm, and when they do harm you, they immediately rationalize it. I didn't mean to. It was for your own good. You misunderstood me. I'm just being honest. This refusal to face their inner duality allows them to hurt you with a clear conscience, and if you confront them, they act like you're the problem. Split psyche: when the saint and the shadow share the same soul. Jung warned that when the shadow is repressed, it doesn't just disappear, it grows more primitive and dangerous. This is why a person can be deeply spiritual and still be emotionally manipulative, be a loving parent and still cause profound emotional neglect, be highly intelligent and still gaslight or betray others. These people live in a split psyche. They have over-identified with one part of themselves, the good, righteous, moral side, and denied the other. But denial doesn't cure the shadow, it empowers it. The more someone insists, "I'm not capable of that," the more their unconscious finds ways to act it out, often at the expense of those closest to them. Moral superiority is a red flag. One of Jung's most critical insights is this: people who present themselves as morally superior often have the darkest shadows. Why? Because the more light you shine in one direction, the darker the shadow behind you becomes. The person who constantly preaches about goodness, forgiveness, or righteousness may be doing so to avoid facing their own inner contradictions. They talk about love, but they don't live it. They talk about law, but they ignore the people they hurt. They talk about healing, but they dismiss your pain. Their virtue becomes their mask. Their kindness becomes a tool of manipulation. Their reputation becomes a shield against accountability. And when they hurt you, they'll hide behind that image. "I'm not that kind of person," they'll say, and everyone will believe them except the person who knows their truth, you. Passive aggression, the shadow's favorite weapon of the good. When someone is overly identified with being nice, they don't express their anger directly. Instead, it leaks out sideways through passive aggression. Examples include making jokes that aren't really jokes, withholding affection as punishment, saying "I'm fine" while clearly being hostile, sabotaging you in subtle ways, playing the victim after they hurt you. These behaviors are common among people who can't consciously admit that they're angry, resentful, or envious. So instead of saying "I'm upset," They find covert ways to assert power. This is shadow behavior, unacknowledged, unowned, and deeply damaging. Projection: when their unseen darkness becomes your burden. When someone can't face their own capacity for cruelty, they project it onto others. They'll say, "You're manipulative. You're toxic. You're making me out to be the bad guy." But really, they're describing themselves. They are projecting their shadow onto you so they don't have to deal with the dissonance of being the bad one. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But these individuals refuse to take that path. Instead, they make you the villain in the story they're too afraid to rewrite. The cruelty of denial. It may not seem like cruelty when someone says, "Let's just move on," or "I don't want to talk about it." But when you're in pain, deep emotional pain, denial is cruelty. Refusing to acknowledge harm doesn't erase the wound, it multiplies it. Jung recognized that one of the worst things someone can do is refuse to see what they've done. Not only does it invalidate your experience, it forces you to carry the weight of a reality they've abandoned. You end up holding their guilt, their shadow, their silence, and wondering if you're crazy. That's not an accident. It's psychological projection and emotional outsourcing. And it's what people do when they lack the courage to look in the mirror. How nice people get away with abuse. Because society often rewards politeness, charisma, and surface-level decency. Many people who harm others fly under the radar. Their cruelty is not dramatic, it's subtle. Their control is not physical, it's emotional. Their abuse is not violent, it's psychological. And when you try to speak up, people don't believe you. They would never do that. They say, "He's such a great guy. She's always helping others." But what they don't see is how the person weaponizes their goodness to avoid accountability. And that may be the most insidious form of cruelty of all, when someone uses their light to blind you to their darkness. Integration is the only path to wholeness. Jung was clear: no one becomes whole by pretending to be perfect. We only heal when we confront the parts of ourselves we're most ashamed of. When we say, "Yes, I can be selfish. Yes, I have the capacity to hurt. Yes, I've failed people. Yes, I've lied, denied, or been unfair." Only through this radical honesty can we integrate the shadow. Only then can we stop acting out harm unconsciously. But most people don't want wholeness. They want comfort. They want to keep the illusion intact. And as long as they do, their shadow will keep hurting others, especially those who dare to get close. Why their cruelty doesn't cancel their goodness, but it must be acknowledged. Jung never said that people are all good or all bad. He believed we are both. That means someone can genuinely love you and still hurt you. Someone can be generous and still be manipulative. Someone can be spiritual and still be abusive. The point is not to demonize them, but to stop romanticizing them. Stop giving people free passes because they have a good heart. Stop waiting for consistency from someone who is fragmented. Stop believing that cruelty doesn't count if it's done with a smile. Good people can do bad things. And if they're not willing to face that, they'll keep doing them. Part 5: Why you attract people who hurt you. It's a pattern that feels like a curse. You keep ending up with the same kind of people, the ones who wound, manipulate, abandon, or betray you. Different faces, different names, but somehow the same emotional outcome: pain. Why does this happen? Why do you attract people who hurt you, even when you swear you've learned your lesson? According to Carl Jung, the answer lies not in what you consciously want, but in what your unconscious seeks. You are not just attracting people. You are recreating internal dynamics, reliving unresolved wounds, and unconsciously trying to finish stories that were never given a proper ending. The unconscious is the true matchmaker. Most people assume they choose their relationships logically, based on compatibility, attraction, or shared values. But Jung's work reveals something deeper. You don't just pick people with your mind, you draw them in with your unconscious. If you have unhealed wounds, especially from childhood, your unconscious will seek out people who trigger those wounds. Not because you want more pain, but because your psyche is trying to resolve what's unresolved. This is the psychological phenomenon known as repetition compulsion. You unconsciously repeat painful dynamics from the past, hoping this time it will be different, hoping that this time the person will stay, will love you right, will see your worth. But they don't, and the cycle repeats until you become conscious of what's really going on. Repetition, compulsion, reliving the old wounds. Let's say you grew up with a parent who was emotionally unavailable. Your inner child never got the nurturing or validation they needed. As an adult, you may find yourself irresistibly drawn to people who are cold, distant, or withholding. Why? Because your unconscious believes that if you can make this person love you, it will heal the original wound. This is not love. This is emotional time travel. You're not falling for them. You're falling into a familiar pain. Your nervous system says, "This feels like home," not because it's safe, but because it's known. And the psyche craves the known even if it hurts. Shadow attraction, you are drawn to what you reject in yourself. Another reason you attract hurtful people, because they embody your shadow, the parts of yourself you've disowned. Maybe you've always been the caretaker, the empath, the nice one. You pride yourself on compassion, sacrifice, and emotional availability. But deep down, you may have repressed anger, boundaries, or self-protection. So what happens? You attract someone who lives out those repressed traits, but in toxic form. They're selfish, cold, dismissive. What you won't be, they are. What you suppress, they express. And in a twisted way, this completes you. Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed, but without consciousness, the reaction becomes destruction." You're not just hurt by them, you're magnetized to them, because your psyche is screaming, "Look at what you're hiding from yourself." Childhood imprints, when trauma becomes your love language. Your first experience of love was your blueprint. If love came with conditions, criticism, or chaos, your nervous system encoded that as normal. So as an adult, you mistake trauma responses for chemistry. You think the butterflies, it's attraction when they're really anxiety, the silent table mystery when it's actually emotional unavailability, the hot-cold dynamic airborne passion when it's actually manipulation. Your body remembers what your mind forgot, and that's why you keep ending up with people who make you feel small, desperate, and unworthy. Because deep inside, you still believe this is what I have to survive to earn love. You are not addicted to them, you're addicted to the pattern. It's easy to think you're hooked on a person, but often, what you're really addicted to is the emotional loop. The highs and lows, the validation and withdrawal, the hope that maybe this time they'll change, that this time you'll be enough. Jung would call this a neurotic attachment, an unconscious loyalty to your pain, and as long as you're not aware of it, it will control you. You'll keep choosing people who hurt you, not because you like pain, but because pain is familiar. It's what you were trained to tolerate, and somewhere inside, it still feels like love. The savior complex, trying to heal others to avoid healing yourself. Many people who attract toxic partners are natural empaths or healers. They see someone's wounds and think, if I just love them enough, they'll change. This is noble but deeply unconscious. Often, you're trying to heal them to avoid healing yourself. Focusing on their pain lets you ignore your own. Their chaos gives you a purpose. Their brokenness makes you feel needed. But healing doesn't work that way. You can't save someone who isn't ready, and trying to rescue them becomes a form of emotional self-abandonment. You ignore your needs, silence your pain, and shrink your light all to fix someone who never asked to be fixed. That's not love, that's martyrdom. And Jung would say it's your shadow wearing a halo. Your aura attracts what you haven't resolved. Jung believed that the psyche emits energy, and this energy pulls people towards us, not just consciously, but vibrationally. If your energy is full of unhealed abandonment, betrayal, or worthlessness, you may attract people who match that frequency. Not because you deserve it, but because energy seeks resonance. That's why when you begin healing, Certain people naturally fall away, not because they changed, but because you did. Your field no longer matches their chaos. Your body no longer tolerates what your soul used to call love. This is how you break the cycle, not by changing them, but by changing what in you was still calling them in. Lack of boundaries equals open invitation for abuse. People who hurt others often seek out those with weak boundaries, not because they're evil, but because they unconsciously seek control. If you don't know how to say no, express anger, or walk away, you become an easy target. This doesn't make you weak. It makes you wounded. Jung taught that boundaries are not walls, they are structures of self-worth. When you lack them, it's often because you were never taught that your needs matter. You learn to earn love by pleasing others, not protecting yourself. So when someone crosses your line, you justify it. When they mistreat you, you rationalize it. When they withdraw, you chase. And the cycle continues. Not because you like being hurt, but because your inner child is still trying to win love by being good. Romanticizing pain as depth. Some of us associate suffering with depth. We think that if a relationship is turbulent, dramatic, or painful, it must be real, passionate, meant to be. But this is trauma speaking, not truth. Jung warned that unresolved trauma can seduce us into believing that pain is spiritual, that suffering is romantic, that chaos is a soulmate sign. It's not. Love is not proven by how much you're willing to endure. It's proven by how safe, seen, and strong you become in someone's presence. If you keep attracting pain, it's not because you're cursed. It's because your wounds still think love requires suffering. Unconscious guilt when you think you deserve the hurt. Deep inside many people lies an invisible shame. I am too much. I am not enough. I am unworthy. If this belief lives in your unconscious, it becomes a magnet for mistreatment. You attract people who mirror what you secretly believe about yourself. This is not about blame, it's about awakening. Because when you heal that belief, when you remember that your worth is not up for debate, you stop dancing for breadcrumbs. You stop begging for basic decency. You stop staying where you're only tolerated. You become a sanctuary for your own soul, and people who can't respect that sanctuary will stop finding the key. Breaking the pattern, what Jung would say. Carl Jung would not tell you to avoid relationships. He would tell you to become conscious, to look at your patterns, your attractions, your pain, and ask, what is this teaching me about my shadow? What inner story am I unconsciously replaying? What part of me still believes I must suffer to be loved? He would remind you that your external world reflects your internal state, and when you heal your psyche, your relationships transform. Not overnight, but irrevocably. You'll start feeling bored by the drama you once chased. You'll feel allergic to the silence you once tolerated. You'll crave peace more than passion. And you'll realize you were never broken, you were just unaware. Now you see, and that's everything. Part 6. Defend yourself or forgive. Breaking the cycle of pain. When someone hurts you, especially repeatedly, you find yourself at a painful crossroads. Should I protect myself, or should I forgive them? Should I walk away, or should I give them another chance? These questions are not just moral, they are deeply psychological. According to Carl Jung, the answer isn't binary. The challenge isn't choosing between self-defense and forgiveness. The deeper challenge is integrating your pain in a way that doesn't repeat itself and doesn't turn you into what hurt you. The path forward is not a clean break or blind acceptance. It's a psychological and spiritual reckoning, and it begins with reclaiming your power. The illusion of forgiveness as weakness. One of the most common misconceptions is that forgiveness is surrender, that it means letting people off the hook, condoning bad behavior, or becoming a doormat. But Jung would argue that true forgiveness is an act of strength. It does not mean you forget. It does not mean you tolerate. It means you transcend the emotional hold the person has on you. When you forgive from a place of wholeness, not obligation, you release the psychic energy that keeps you tied to the one who hurt you. You no longer seek revenge. You no longer obsess. You no longer wait for an apology that may never come. You forgive not because they deserve it, but because you deserve freedom. But first, you must defend the psyche before forgiveness can be genuine. Jung would say that the psyche must first defend itself. If someone is actively hurting you, gaslighting you, or violating your boundaries, the most spiritual thing you can do is walk away. This is not hatred, it's protection. You must create emotional and energetic distance in order to process the pain with clarity. Without distance, your forgiveness becomes another form of self-abandonment. Defending yourself isn't about attacking them. It's about declaring, my soul is not a battleground. My peace is not negotiable. My worth is not up for debate. Forgiveness, without protection, turns into martyrdom. And Jung taught that the martyr archetype, when unconscious, becomes destructive, not healing. Setting boundaries is a sacred act. Boundaries are not walls. They are containers of self-worth. People with weak boundaries often confuse compassion with tolerance, empathy with endurance. But boundaries say, I see your humanity, but I also honor mine. In Jungian language, boundaries are a manifestation of the individuated self, the self that has emerged from unconscious programming and now operates from integration, not survival. Setting a boundary is not rejection of the other, it is an affirmation of the self. And it is often the first step toward authentic forgiveness, because only when you feel safe, respected, and sovereign can you forgive from a place of empowerment, not fear. The ego wants revenge. The soul seeks understanding. When you're hurt, your ego often screams, make them pay, show them what they did, prove your worth. But Jung emphasized the difference between the ego's desire for retaliation and the soul's need for resolution. The ego believes that hurting back restores balance. The soul knows that hurting others never truly heals us. This is not to say you should suppress anger. On the contrary, anger is sacred. It tells you where your boundaries have been crossed, where your worth has been ignored. But once anger has been acknowledged and expressed, the deeper task is transformation. Revenge is cyclical. It keeps you tied to the one who harmed you. Forgiveness breaks that bond not to deny the pain, but to prevent it from owning your future. Understanding does not mean excusing. Forgiveness becomes possible when we understand the psychic reality of the other person. That doesn't mean we condone their behavior. It means we see that their actions came from fear, ignorance, trauma, or unconsciousness. You might say they lied because they're afraid of vulnerability. They manipulated because they never learned healthy control. They ghosted me because intimacy triggered their abandonment wound. This is empathy, not self-deception. You don't excuse it, but you stop personalizing it. You realize it wasn't about me, it was about them. And in that shift, you reclaim your narrative. You stop being the victim of someone else's unconscious behavior and start becoming the author of your own healing. The wounded healer archetype, healing through compassion. Jung introduced the concept of the wounded healer, the person who transforms their pain into wisdom. This does not mean seeking pain. It means using pain as a portal. When someone hurts you, and you choose to face it consciously, you begin the process of alchemical transformation. You don't deny the wound. You descend into it. You learn its language. You trace its origin. You feel its burn. And then you rise. Forgiveness becomes not just a release of the other. It becomes a rebirth of the self. The wound doesn't disappear. It becomes a scar, a reminder not of what broke you, but of what shaped you. What happens when you forgive too soon? Premature forgiveness is a form of bypassing. It's often driven by the need to be the bigger person, avoid conflict, or suppress uncomfortable emotions. But Jung warned what is not felt cannot be healed. If you forgive before you've acknowledged the betrayal, expressed the rage, or grieved the loss, that energy doesn't vanish, it gets buried, and buried emotions become psychological time bombs. You might say, I'm over it, while still dreaming about revenge. You might say, I forgive them, while silently resenting yourself for staying. You might say, I've moved on, but your body still tenses when you hear their name. Forgiveness must come after you've honored the full emotional experience. not as a shortcut, but as a culmination. Forgiveness without contact closure comes from within. Some people believe they can't forgive unless the other person apologizes. But in Jungian terms, closure is an internal process. Waiting for an apology keeps your healing in someone else's hands. It says, "You owe me peace." But peace is not something they can give you, it's something you must claim. You can forgive without reconciliation. You can find closure without conversation. You can bless them from a distance. And when the need to explain, confront, or prove disappears, that's when you know you've truly forgiven. Not because it didn't matter, but because you matter more. Self-forgiveness, the step everyone forgets. In every painful relationship, there's usually one person you're the hardest on yourself. You replay the signs you ignored. You regret staying too long. You hate yourself for what you tolerated. And this internal shame becomes even more damaging than the original wound. Jung emphasized that self-forgiveness is essential to wholeness. You are not just the one who was hurt, you are also the one who abandoned yourself in the process. Forgive yourself for needing love, for hoping they'd change, for not being ready to walk away. You didn't fail. You were learning, loving, trusting, and now you're awake. Self-forgiveness is not letting yourself off the hook. It's calling yourself back home. Distinguishing between forgiveness and reconnection. Just because you forgive someone does not mean you let them back in. Forgiveness is an internal release. Reconnection is an external choice. And Jung would argue that unless the other person has done deep shadow work, unless they've faced their own inner demons, they will likely hurt you again. You can forgive someone and still never speak to them again. You can forgive someone and still block their number. You can forgive someone and still say you are not safe for me. That's not pettiness, that's maturity. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. Reconnection is a privilege they must earn. The alchemy of forgiveness, transforming pain into power. Jung often used the metaphor of alchemy to describe psychological transformation. In alchemy, base metals are turned into gold. In the psyche, trauma is turned into wisdom. Forgiveness is alchemical. It takes the base material of betrayal, loss, or rejection and transmutes it into clarity, compassion, and sovereignty. You start as the victim. You move through the fire as the warrior. And you emerge as the healer, not just for others, but for yourself. This is not bypassing, this is mastery. It's what happens when you take your pain, honor it, protect it, and then offer it back to the world as medicine. Part 7. When you stay silent, do they feel comfortable or fearful? Silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in the human experience. It is often seen as weakness, indifference, or avoidance. But silence, when conscious, is anything but powerless. According to Carl Jung, silence can be one of the most potent psychological and spiritual tools we have, especially in response to those who have hurt us. When you go quiet, it doesn't always mean you've surrendered. In many cases, it means you've stepped out of their game, the game of ego, the game of control, the game of reaction. The person who hurt you might assume your silence means comfort, that they got away with it. But what they fail to realize is that silence, when anchored in consciousness, isn't submission, it's transformation. And that silence doesn't free them from consequence, it forces them to face themselves. The ego craves noise, silence is its enemy. The ego thrives on reaction. It feeds off attention, validation, arguments, and being right. When you react, you're feeding the other person's ego. You're proving that they still have emotional control over you. But when you respond with silence, you starve the ego, not only theirs, but yours too. Jung believed that silence initiates a descent into the unconscious. When there's no distraction, no more shouting, defending, or chasing, what's left is the psyche's raw material. And that's terrifying for someone who's been avoiding themselves. So while your silence may look like distance, it actually becomes a mirror, a psychological space where they are forced to confront what they said, what they did, and who they've become. Conscious silence versus suppressed silence. Not all silence is created equal. There's the kind of silence that comes from fear of conflict, rejection, or abandonment. That's suppressed silence. It's filled with anxiety, self-betrayal, and shame. But conscious silence is entirely different. It's not avoidance, it's alignment. It's not repression, it's self-respect. It's not punishment, it's power. Conscious silence arises when you know that speaking won't lead to truth, that arguing won't lead to change, and that engaging would only pull you back into a dynamic that no longer serves your soul. Jung taught that sometimes the most transformative thing you can do is withdraw your energy, not as a strategy, but as a sacred act of self-preservation. Silence is a mirror for the unconscious. The person who hurt you may appear unaffected by your silence. They may go on posting, smiling, pretending nothing happened, but if they are remotely connected to their own psyche, your absence begins to work on them from the inside out. Why? Because silence removes distraction, and in its place, the unconscious starts to speak. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul, and your silence removes that avoidance. Without your attention, they can't project. Without your reactions, they can't manipulate. Without your presence, they're left with the only voice they've been running from their own. And in that stillness, the truth gets louder. Silence doesn't equal forgiveness or forgetfulness. Many people assume that when you stop talking, it means you've let it go. But Jung would argue that silence doesn't imply resolution, it implies processing. You may be silent because you're integrating, because you're reclaiming your energy, because you've realized that engagement isn't healing, it's reopening the wound. And just because you're not expressing your pain doesn't mean it isn't there. In fact, sometimes your silence is a sign that you've finally taken your pain seriously enough to stop sharing it with people who don't deserve access to it. Your silence becomes a boundary, a line that says, this space is for my healing, not your performance. The psychological effect of your silence on them. Whether they admit it or not, your silence affects them, and it does so in ways you may never see. It may stir guilt they've buried. It may provoke anxiety they can't name. It may trigger memories they try to suppress. It may remind them that their actions had consequences. Jung described this as the activation of the shadow. When a person's external world no longer supports their self-deception, the unconscious rises, and often it begins with discomfort. That discomfort may come out as anger. Why aren't you answering? As projection, you're being childish. As sarcasm, I guess you're too good to talk now. Or even as silence in return. But underneath all of that is a psychic disturbance. A disturbance that tells them, even if they deny it, something has shifted and I can't control it anymore. Why silence can be more terrifying than confrontation. When you confront someone, they get to fight back. They can defend themselves, twist your words, or play the victim. But when you go silent, they lose the script. They're no longer in control of the narrative. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know how you feel. They don't know what you'll do next. And that uncertainty is unbearable for people who rely on control to feel safe.